Somewhere between Erie, Pennsylvania and Knox, New York in 1980, mother of five Jeanne Marie Scrima had gone missing. Even though investigation ensued, with hundreds of people being interviewed and leads being followed up on, in the almost 5 decades since her disappearance, Jeanne Marie Scrima has never been heard from again. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Vanished Memories, a channel dedicated to getting out lesser-known true crime and missing persons cases. Today, I will be presenting to you the case of Jeanne Marie Scrima, a 44-year-old mother of 5 who went missing, like I said, somewhere between Erie, Pennsylvania and Knox, New York. This all happened on March 19th of 1980. If you are interested in this type of content, please subscribe to the channel as I put out new videos every Wednesday. Without further ado, let's get into this case. Jeanne Marie Scrima was born on October 15th, 1935. Unfortunately, even though I do like to get into the background of the people that I talk about on this channel, there really wasn't much to garner about her. Due to the age of this case, there is a lot of limited information. What we do know is that at some point in Jeanne's life, she would become married to a man, and at some point they would have a daughter together, though that man is unnamed. At the time of this case taking place in 1980, this child was actually moved out of the family home, so I'm assuming that the child, her daughter, would likely have been around 18 at the time. So given this fact, it's likely that her first child was born around the late 1950s or early 1960s, so I'm going to assume that Jeanne likely had her between the age of 30 and 35. Though, of course, this is just an estimate and we don't have an actual date of birth for her daughter. Sometime after her daughter's birth, though, Jeanne and the daughter's father, her husband at the time, would get a divorce. From what I could tell, this separation seemed amicable, as I wasn't able to find any information about Jeanne's ex-husband, so I don't think that there was any bad blood between them per se. At some point after this, Jeanne would go on to meet her second husband, John Scrima, who she had met while working at a restaurant in New York City. Again, we unfortunately don't know the exact timeline of this, but we do know that John and Jeanne would eventually get married, as I said, and they would go on to have 4 children together, 3 girls and 1 boy. At this time in the case in 1980, the family would be living at a farmhouse on Knox-Gallup-ville Road in Knox, New York. However, the marriage between Jeanne and John would be on the rocks by February of 1980, and at that time, Jeanne would file for divorce. Now, we don't know exactly what caused their relationship to be on the rocks, but we do know that Jeanne would actually describe to her friends that John Scrima was, quote, verbally abusive. So it seems that this likely was a factor in her leaving him. During the period in which the divorce was being processed, Jeanne would actually start an affair with a man named John Sidney, and he resided somewhere in Schoharie County in New York. So I know that both these men are named John, so for the sake of this not being so confusing throughout the video, I will be trying to refer to them either by their last name or their full name. Regarding John Sidney, I'm really not sure how him and Jeanne met, but we do know that, of course, they would go on to have an affair during the divorce proceedings. However, from what I'm able to tell, this affair did start after Jeanne filed for divorce. It did not seem to be the catalyst for divorce for her. That information that I've just shared with you pretty much takes us to the day of March 18th, 1980. On that day, Jeanne would call home to let her children know that she was going to be back the next day, March 19th, after being away for a few days on a trip. She had told her children that she was on a visit to Florida. Allegedly, according to some sources, she had told them that she was visiting a relative, but we now know that she was actually in Erie, Pennsylvania. She was there in order to meet John Sidney, her affair partner, in a hotel. Unfortunately, even though Jeanne had called her children on March 18th to let them know that she would be back before they got off the school bus on March 19th, this would be the last time that her children would hear from her. The next day, on Wednesday, March 19th, Jeanne would leave at daybreak in order to return to her family home in Knox, New York. She was headed home in her vehicle, which was a 1977 Lincoln Continental with New York plates 458 LXS. John Sidney would say that he had watched her that day drive off and onto an interstate highway in western Pennsylvania. However, Jeanne would never make it home that day. Even though Jeanne never made it home, what's interesting is that her husband, John Scrima, had never actually reported her as missing. In fact, her divorce lawyer, Richard Antical, was actually the one to make the call to police to notify them that he believed that she was missing after realizing that he hadn't been able to get in contact with her for about a month. I did want to point out here that for some reason the Charlie Project states that she wasn't reported as missing until May 4th, 1980, but from the New York State Police Department's own Facebook post, they would say that they started investigating the case on April 7th, 1980. It seems that the Charlie Project got this information from Times Union, which is a news website, but I was unable to find this information anywhere else. Again, remember, according to the New York State Police's own admission, they started investigating on April 7th, so that seems like the date that makes the most sense. You'll see throughout my coverage of this case in this video that there's a lot of information that the Charlie Project says about the case, but there's not a lot of information to back that up. But I will be addressing that throughout this video as it comes up. After Jeanne was eventually reported missing, an investigation would be launched into her disappearance. Over the course of that investigation, a witness would say that they had actually seen Jeanne's car, that 1977 Lincoln Continental, in Fultonville, New York. This was an area about 40 to 45 minutes away from her residence in Knox, New York. According to the witness, they did see the car, and it seems as though this is a verified account of that vehicle, but they did not get a description of the driver, so we don't know who was driving the vehicle at the time. We also, unfortunately, don't know the exact date that this witness had seen her vehicle. Later, though a specific date is not exactly known, Jeanne's vehicle will be found abandoned in Oakland County, Michigan. This is an area about 10 hours away from her residence in Knox, New York, if you're not passing through Canada to get to it. The Charlie Project states that this vehicle, according to investigators, had been passed through many different owners until its alleged discovery on October 5th of 1980, but again, there's no other source information to back this up. Unfortunately, Charlie Project does a very poor job of citing their sources, so I'm just unable to verify if that is the case. John Sidney, the man that Jeanne was having an affair with, would be, of course, questioned in connection to her case. But from what I was able to tell, he never really seemed to be a big suspect, and he was very cooperative throughout the investigation. He even took a polygraph examination, which he would pass. According to an article from 2002, so a full 22 years after this case would take place, police said that John Sidney was still cooperative with the investigation to that day. When it comes to John Scrima, though, Jeanne's soon-to-be ex-husband, it doesn't seem like he was quite as cooperative, but again, this information comes from the Charlie Project and has no backing to it. The Charlie Project alleges that as soon as the investigation started, John had actually lawyered up and became pretty much completely uncooperative with the investigation. What we do know, though, is that properties belonging to Scrima actually were searched during the course of the investigation. Police said that they had searched the family farmhouse in Knox, New York, as well as property that Scrima owned both in Schoharie County and Montgomery counties, but it seemed as though they found nothing, even though they would actually describe in that 2002 newspaper I referenced earlier, we were looking for fresh graves. So it seems that police were kind of suspicious of John Scrima, but nothing really came of that. Over the decades since this case took place, police have interviewed hundreds of people. They've also followed leads to New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio, and Michigan, but unfortunately nothing substantial has ever come up. We do know that sometime after Jeanne's disappearance, her soon-to-be ex-husband, John Scrima, would actually sell their farmhouse in Knox, New York. He had moved with the 4 children to a place on Gidley Road in Esperance, New York. This is about 25 minutes or so away from the original farmhouse property in Knox, New York. So, like I said, there really hasn't been much movement in the case, at least not in the way of leads. This case has pretty much gone cold since she went missing in March of 1980. There has been some public outreach in the years since from the New York State Police Department, which is the investigating agency in her case, but unfortunately, like I said, it doesn't seem that any substantial information has been garnered from those. There was a newspaper article in the Daily Gazette, the one that I referenced from 2002, that was actually very helpful in obtaining a lot of information in this case. In this article, they actually interview Jeanne's daughter, Jocelyn, who was 13 at the time of her mother's disappearance. Jocelyn had said that even though some of her siblings had kind of made peace and come to terms with the fact that their mother had disappeared, she never had. She would state to the paper, "I want to know what happened to my mother. I want to know for sure if my mother is dead. I want to know if my mother is alive. I don't care about the who's, the what's, the when's. I just want closure. However, the paper that wrote this article actually also attempted to interview Jocelyn's father, or Jeanne's soon-to-be ex-husband, Jeanne Scrima, and it seems he did not feel at all the same as the way that his daughter Jocelyn felt about Jeanne's disappearance. At the time of this interview, Scrima was a 73-year-old retired construction worker who still lived in Esperance, New York, where he had originally moved his children to. When a reporter from the Daily Gazette had spoken to him about the case, Scrima stated, "I'd rather not talk about it. It's something that happened 25 years ago." When the reporters had continued on and asked him about the state continuing to look into his wife's disappearance, he stated, "At this point, I really don't care. It was 25 years ago." Shortly after this, he would abruptly end the interview after seeing the reporter write down his remarks, saying, "I don't go for that." With all that being said, I think now is a really good time to get into the theories in this case, and I'm really only going over 2 theories. My first one is that Jeanne had left of her own volition. Now, if you've watched my videos before, you know that I kind of present my theories from least believable to most believable in my opinion, and that makes this opinion of the 2 least believable. From what I can tell, this theory is kind of ruled out. No one seems to really believe that Jeanne had just left on her own accord, abandoning her 5 children. There's just so many reasons that this theory doesn't quite make sense. The first thing that stuck out to me is that Jeanne had called her children the night before she was due to leave. In that call, she specifically stated that she would be there when their bus arrived home from school that day. What would be the point of her making that call and making that promise if she knew that she was not going to return home? I could definitely see her wanting to call her children to speak with them one last time, but it just doesn't make much sense to me for her to have made that empty promise to them. Also, by all accounts, it seems as though Jeanne didn't have any reason to leave her children. She was a great mother, and according to her daughter Jocelyn from that 2002 newspaper, she would say of her mother, "She was my nurturer, she was my caretaker, she loved me and I knew it, and she loved my brother and sister too." So again, it doesn't seem like she would be someone that was willing to just leave her children. Another thing that I thought of was the fact that we don't know where Jeanne had gone. You would think that if she did intend on just upping and leaving the family, she probably would have done so with John Sidney, the person that she was having an affair with. But we know that John really didn't have any connection with this case, as far as we can tell. So what would she have gained from just leaving her family and leaving the man that she was having an affair with? Where would she have gone? Also, to me, it doesn't really make sense that she would flee her family to leave this man, knowing that she would eventually be leaving her husband since they were in the middle of divorce. She would have openly been able to be with John Sidney and her children after the divorce happened. In addition, police do believe that Jeanne was met with foul play. In the newspaper article that I've been referencing, police investigator Gloria J. Coppola said, "I believe she made it close to home that day, March 19th, and something happened to her." So that, of course, brings us to our next theory, which is that she was met with foul play. This theory is the most plausible in this case, and I don't think that that's hard to refute. It explains why she never made it home to her children that day, and why there have been apparently no reported sightings of her since. It is most likely that someone had chose to bring her harm that day, likely killing her. That person that I think a lot of suspicion falls on is, of course, her soon-to-be ex-husband, Jeanne Scrima. Of course, we know that Jeanne Scrima had never actually been arrested or charged with anything to do with her disappearance, but it seems like there is a lot of information out there that kind of leads one to believe that he's at least suspicious when it comes to Jeanne's disappearance. The first thing that leads me to believe that John unfortunately could have wanted Jeanne dead was their impending divorce. We know that Jeanne filed for divorce in February and she went missing in March, so that's only about a month between the divorce filing and when she had gone missing. Unfortunately, in a lot of true crime cases, we see instances of a divorce being a catalyst for violence or for someone killing their partner. In this case, it definitely could have resulted in Jeanne's death. Also, divorce means that assets are split up. Namely, what could have been split up was money, and we know that actually Jeanne did not work. She was a homemaker at the time, so she would not have been able to support the children on her own. And also, the farmhouse could have been an asset that Jeanne would have got as well. That would be enough motive for John to want to harm her or get rid of her so that he did not have to give up the farmhouse or any of his money. Allegedly, according to the Charlie Project as well, Jeanne told John about her plans to open a restaurant in Duanesburg, New York, with the money she would receive from their sale of the property after their divorce. Again, I couldn't find any other sources stating that, and I'm also not sure which John they're referring to, whether they're referring to Jeanne's soon-to-be ex-husband, John Scrima, or Jeanne's affair partner, John Sidney. However, we can assume that if this statement is correct, Jeanne may have told John Sidney this. That's because, again, it seems likely, but not fully confirmed, that John Scrima was not fully cooperative in this investigation, so I don't know why he would have told the authorities that in that case. John Scrima also could have been motivated to hurt Jeanne if he was aware of the fact that Jeanne was having an affair. Again, the affair seems to have started after the filing of divorce, but learning that fact could have definitely made John Scrima angry enough to do something to hurt or kill Jeanne. I will say I did see one bit of information, again, from the Charlie Project that said she, as in Jeanne, learned that her husband realized she was having an affair during a phone conversation with her sister on March 18th. I'm assuming this is referencing that her sister and her had had a phone call on March 18th about this, not that John had overheard a phone call that they had on March 18th, because we know that Jeanne was not home on that day. Again, unfortunately, this information could not be fully verified, as I only was able to find it from the Charlie Project, but once again, it could have been a motive for John if he had found out about the affair somehow. Additionally, we do know that John Scrima didn't seem to have that much cooperation in the case, according to the Charlie Project, and also not much care for what happened to his wife. For someone to have said about their partner's disappearance to a reporter for a newspaper, quote unquote, "I really don't care," it's definitely pretty suspicious. So John Scrima could have had two motives in doing something to harm or kill his wife. That is the impending divorce, as well as possibly finding out about her affair. John also likely would have had the time to actually do so, when you consider the fact that his children would have been in school on the day that Jeanne was due to come home. Jeanne likely left that morning around daybreak, like she said, so I would say probably 7 to 7:30 in the morning. The drive from Erie, Pennsylvania to Knox, New York would have taken her about 6 hours. That would mean that she likely would have arrived home between 1 and 1:30, which likely would have been before her children would have been home from school. That gives John that window of opportunity to have done something to Jeanne. However, like I said, this is just a theory, and at the end of the day, even though the police did thoroughly investigate this case, John has never been arrested or charged with anything to do with Jeanne's disappearance, and I feel like that makes a lot of sense. It could have been that there was evidence to exclude him, or maybe just not enough evidence to include him in this case. Additionally, we don't know if maybe John was at work at the time or had some other alibi that just fully ruled him out. So again, this really is just a theory at the end of the day. Now, normally around here I finish the video and kind of sum up the case, but I'm actually going to add a new section, at least to some videos that I do, and that's going to be the unanswered questions section. I started this section due to the fact that I was actually researching another case, which will be coming out either next week or the week after, and during the course of researching that case, I was left with so many unanswered questions that I thought it was important to address those. And in this case, on Jeanne Scrima, I feel like there's one big unanswered question that's kind of been bugging me throughout the research. My biggest question was, how did the vehicle end up in Michigan? According to the Charlie Project, it had gone through several owners before being abandoned, but if that's the case, then why would an owner have abandoned it in the first place? If someone had innocently purchased the vehicle, why would they choose to just abandon that vehicle? Did they possibly realize that the vehicle belonged to a missing person and panic? And if so, why would they do that and not go to the authorities? Any good person who had just innocently purchased a vehicle that they did not know was tied to a disappearance or a crime would have just turned that into authorities. Even further than that, though, it doesn't seem like anyone from Michigan would have really known about Jeanne's disappearance. Initially, when I started my research for this case, I looked into newspapers.com, which is a great source for finding archived newspapers about pretty much anything. And when I looked up Jeanne's name, pretty much no articles came up. So it doesn't seem like this was a big case, not even in Knox, New York at the time. So how would someone from Oakland County, Michigan even know about Jeanne's case enough to just abandon the vehicle in the first place? Also, my biggest question is, if the vehicle was in fact sold, do we know who was the initial person to sell the vehicle? Of course, it would be a lot more telling if, say, either Jeanne had sold the vehicle or her soon-to-be ex-husband, Jeanne Scrima. And if Jeanne was the one to sell it, why would she have done so knowing that she was going to abandon her only method of transportation at a time when maybe she was trying to flee from her family? Also, in general, I would just like to know who was driving the car in Fultonville, New York. Also, I would love to know the exact date when that witness had seen this person driving that car. Could it have been while Jeanne was on her drive home and that was her, or was it after she had arrived home and someone else had took her car? We also have to remember in the whole investigation of this as well that Jeanne was not reported as missing until like a full 3 weeks after she had gone missing. So there's that gap of time for someone to have seen something but not known that it was connected to anything criminal or anything related to someone's disappearance. So again, that makes me wonder what that witness had actually seen and when they had actually seen it in Fultonville, New York. Regardless of the theories and unanswered questions, though, unfortunately, to this day, Jeanne Marie Scrima remains missing. At the time of her disappearance, she was 44 years old, and her description was the following. She was white, 5'3", weighed 118 pounds, and had dark brown hair and hazel eyes. No clothing description is given of the day that Jeanne had gone missing, but we do know that she was wearing a gold heart-shaped cocktail ring with diamonds on the outside. Today, if Jeanne is still alive, she would be 90 years old. If you or anyone you know has any information about Jeanne Marie Scrima, who went missing during the period of her traveling home from Erie, Pennsylvania to Knox, New York, you are encouraged to reach out to the proper authorities. Their information will be on screen now, as well as in the description box below, as always. Thank you again for taking the time to listen to the case of Jeanne Marie Scrima, a 44-year-old mother of 5 who was last seen in Erie, Pennsylvania, before traveling on her way home to Knox, New York. She was last seen on March 19th, 1980. If you enjoyed learning about this case or found it educational, please don't hesitate to subscribe, like, comment, or share this video. Again, my name is Brianna, and thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Vanished Memories. Bye!